And it was in Matthew chapter 24, as you turn there, it was in Matthew chapter 24 that the disciples gathered around Jesus at the foot of Mount Olivet, and they were talking to him, and they said, can you tell us about the end of the world? So he proceeds in Matthew chapter 24 to lay out in that chapter the exact same outline that you find here in chapter 6, all the way till you get to chapter 8 and verses 1 and 2. And not only the same outline, but even relatively speaking, in the same order, when you consider that chapter 6, 7, and 8 are not necessarily in order. But whenever he lays those out, he lays them out in the same order that you find here in the book of Revelation. Understanding about how things are going to end is very important. It is very important because what you believe about the end times will determine the way that you behave today. What you believe about the end times will determine the way that you behave today. So far in this book, we have seen the letters addressed to the 7 churches, and we determined the kind of church that we really want to be. Really, that Philadelphian church was the one that we really want to try to model ourselves after. And as we got to chapter 4, we saw the church pictured in John, raptured out, taken out of this earth and brought up, and we got to see heaven and the throne room and all the elders representing the body of Christ receiving their crowns at the judgment seat of Christ and praising the Lord. And then all of a sudden John saw this book beside the throne in chapter 5 that it said that there was no one worthy to open the book, and John began to weep very much. And we thought that that was odd because it seemed like, you go to heaven, you get your rewards, we're all praising God. It seems like we get to chapter 4 and your normal kind of secular religious idea, that seemed like the end of the story, right? You serve God, live a good life, you go to heaven. That's the end. And yet John sees that this book can't be opened and he begins to weep. He's in heaven. And you imagine what in the world could make you cry in heaven? And he sees that the rest of the story can't be completed unless there's someone worthy to crack the seals on that book. And they find that the Lamb that is on the throne, because he has died, shed his blood, and risen from the grave, he is found worthy to open up the book so that you can finish the story, because there's so much more. In fact, when we get to heaven, that's really the beginning of the story, isn't it? That's not the end. That's the beginning. When we get to heaven and we receive our crowns and our rewards, that's when the Lord's going to turn to us as the church, and he's going to be like, are you ready to get started? That's going to be the beginning of our real work. Now's the time where we prove our faithfulness for something greater. If we're faithful in that which is small now, then we will be rewarded in being faithful in something that is greater then. Now we get to show whether or not we can rule and reign with him then. And so that's really the beginning of the story. As you come into Revelation chapter 6, that's where you see the first seal cracked by the Lord. And he opens up the seal and he really kind of begins this trek to the throne where he will sit on David's throne. So in the story, we now turn from heaven, where we've been in chapters 4 and 5. We turn from heaven and we go back to earth in the story in Revelation chapter 6. We go from heaven back to earth, and these seven seals, they run through the entire period of the tribulation. They tell us the entire story. Okay, so you have to understand that. When we see the 7 seals, they tell us the entire story of the tribulation all the way up to the return of Christ. And this marks the beginning of a time period which we know as the tribulation, right here at chapter 6. It's also referred to in the Bible as Jacob's trouble, that time period. And we see, to find this particular time period revealed to us in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, and you can see it in your scriptures. We also have it for you on the screen. This is what the prophet Daniel said. And remember that the book of Daniel is kind of like the book of Revelation for the Old Testament. That's a good way to think of the book of Daniel. And these two books, and you'll see that we'll reference kind of three main sources a lot as we go through the book of Revelation. Obviously the book of Revelation, also the book of Daniel, and Matthew chapter 24 and 25, because they both deal with the same subject matter. But in Daniel 9:24, it says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and the prophecy and to anoint the most holy. That's a heavy to-do list. Usually I can get about 3 or 4 things done in a day. Well, this passage here says that there are 70 weeks, or the way we should understand that is 70 years. 70 years of judgment are determined upon thy people. Who are thy people? Here, he's talking about Israel. It's very important that we understand that. Obviously, we're in the book of Daniel. There is no church. The church doesn't come until after Acts chapter 2. He's talking about the nation of Israel, thy people. And 70 weeks are determined upon the nation of Israel and upon the holy city. So he gets even more specific. We know that is Jerusalem, right? So a week here in this refers to 7 years, not 7 days. So just to show you why we think that, if you look up here at Genesis chapter 29, we see in verse 18, also in verses 25 to 27. Remember whenever Jacob fell in love with Rachel and he wanted her for his wife? So today we would take her out for dinner and try to convince the lady that we have a lot of money or something like that. We would try, if we wanted to marry some lady, we'd try to charm her. But back then, they didn't do that. He went to her dad and he made a deal and said, I'll work for you for 7 years and then you give me your daughter. That's the way they did it. Okay, so it says Jacob loved Rachel and he said, I will serve these 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. She was the second oldest. Leah was the oldest. If you drop down to verse 25, it says, and it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. Well, hold on. I mean, after he worked for 7 years, they had the wedding, and then the wedding night, and then he wakes up, and Leah's beside him. Now that, man, you talk about being surprised. That would be, oh my goodness. And you think, how did he not know? I mean, there's no electricity. You know, it's just dark. I don't know. You can't see. Maybe he had a lot to drink at the reception. I don't know what happened, but he didn't know. He wakes up and Leah's beside him. So he comes to Laban, her father. He says, man, you've tricked me. You've beguiled me. And Laban said, it must not so be done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Laban was a real trickster. He was a very dishonest man. He says, no, we can't do that. Of course, he tells them this after. We have to give the firstborn first. So Laban says, must not be so done. In verse 27, so he says, so fulfill, talking about Rachel, fulfill her week also. Do you see how he says that? And I will give thee this also for service, which thou shalt serve me yet 7 other years. Do you see how he makes that a connection? A week is 7 years. So when we think of a week today, we think of 7 days. And they use that same kind of measure in the sense of a week being 7, but they use it to refer to 7 years, not 7 days. Now, it's really interesting when you look at this chart, you can see that this 70 weeks, it's a week of years, right? He's talking about years, not days. So that's 490 years. And you can see that the entire history of Israel is broken down into these 70 weeks. From Abraham to Exodus, guess how long that was? 490 years, 70 weeks. From Exodus to Solomon's temple was also 70 weeks, 490 years. From Solomon's temple all the way till, when they got exiled and they came back to rebuild under Nehemiah, right? When Artaxerxes gave him the decree to come back and to rebuild, guess how long that was? 70 weeks, 490 years. And it says here in Daniel chapter 9, verses 25 to 26, he says, all the way from the decree to rebuild, that's the one under Nehemiah from Artaxerxes, to the time of Messiah the Prince, that is the time when Christ came upon the ass and rode in and was exalted as the King of Israel. all the way till that point, and he was recognized, and they all sang glory to God in the highest, and they said he was the king, and they recognized him as king. They said all the way up to that point, it says it would be 69 weeks, that is 483 years is up to that point. But it says even though they recognized him as king, he's going to be cut off from his people, he's going to be crucified, he's going to be rejected of his people. So since you only got up to 483 years, guess how much time we have left? Can anybody do the math in your head? We've got exactly 1 week in the 70 weeks left. There's been 69 weeks up to the point that Christ was rejected of his people. Exactly 69 weeks. And then he was rejected. See, when he came for his people Israel. Did you realize that? That's the reason why he came, to fulfill what Daniel had said, and to fulfill his prophecy to be their king and to be accepted by them, but they rejected him as their Messiah. And so, if you will, the time with Israel stopped. They rejected Christ, and so he turned them over, and then he went to the Gentiles. And that's where you saw what we call the New Testament church born. And when you come into what's called the time of the tribulation, of this 70 weeks, how much time is left? There is only 1 week left. 1 week, which is how long? 7 years are left of this time period. That's the reason why when people talk about their 7 years in the tribulation, that's why they say that, is because there are 7 years according to the prophecy that are determined upon the people of who? Israel. There's 7 years determined upon the people of Israel. And so this is why that they say that. So there's only 1 week left, that is 7 years. And the purpose of this week, this 7 years, is sevenfold. There are 7 things, it says, that are supposed to be accomplished according to Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. And it tells you here, I believe they're up there for you. Number 1 is to judge and to purify Israel. And I believe you can see a cross-reference there for Daniel chapter 10, verse 12. To finish the transgression, that is their transgression in rejecting Christ. To bring that to a resolution. To make an end of sins, to take away their sins. To make reconciliation for iniquity, that is to reconcile them back to God. To bring in everlasting righteousness, that is to make them righteous. To seal up the vision and the prophecy, to put it simply, to finish the story. And to anoint the most holy, that is to make Christ king. That is the purpose of the 7 years of tribulation. That is the purpose. The 7 years of tribulation doesn't really have any other purpose than that. It is to purify and to judge the nation of Israel, to finish the transgression, this specifically. Now it's to finish the transgression and to deal with sin in general, but specifically to deal with Israel's sin in rejecting Christ and to take away their sins, which it says that it will do in Romans chapter 11, verse 36. And to make a reconciliation, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision, to finish the story, and to anoint Christ as king. That is the purpose of the 7 years of tribulation. So now let's go on as we look at God's wrath. God's wrath. A couple things that I just want to say about God's wrath, because that's what we see happening in the 7 years. There are some who, when they look at this, the God's wrath, especially when they look at the first half of the tribulation, because this 7 years seems to be divided very clearly into the first section, which is 3.5 years, and the second section, which is 3.5 years. And so people would say that you have the time of tribulation and then you have the time of great tribulation. Is everybody following with me? 3.5 years for one, 3.5 years for the other. And so sometimes people will say, well, God's wrath doesn't really start until the second part. So I just wanted to address that God's wrath seems to begin, some people think, in the second half, the halfway point, and that's where you see God really pouring things out from heaven. You start seeing things, really spiritual demons coming out of hell. You start seeing crazy stuff The real crazy stuff that we think about in Revelation seemed to happen in the last half. And so some people would characterize the first half as saying, well, that's really Satan's wrath, or that's man's comeuppance, or the world's evil begins to take over. Well, we must remember what we've already read in this book. How did all of this begin? The only reason it was able to begin is because Christ, who was found worthy, was able to crack the seal on the book, right? He is the one who began all of this. None of this began without his allowing it to begin. Are you following with me? And that brings us to two really important points when it comes to God's wrath. God's wrath comes in two ways. And this is something important for us to remember even today. God's wrath comes in two ways. One, God steps away. This is one way that God's wrath comes, is by him stepping away. And we see this outlined for us in great detail in the book of Romans in chapter 1. When God goes through the fact that, the world in our sin, whenever we did not want to retain the knowledge of God in our mind, whenever we knew that there was a God, but we did not want to glorify him as God, but we changed the image of God to the image of man and to beast, and we want to worship the four-footed beast, and we want to worship creation and ourselves instead of God. And what does God do in Romans 1? He says, okay. And he says, I just turn them over to a reprobate mind, right? In other words, God will come to a point, if you do not want to worship him as he should be worshiped, God will come to a point wherever he'll say, okay, you have it your way. And he will step away. In fact, this is one of the most terrible ways that God's wrath, and we know that this deals specifically with God's wrath because it says that in Romans chapter 1, whenever it says that, as you look in verses 17 and 18, it says, for the wrath of God has been revealed, right, from heaven upon the ungodliness of man. And how is it revealed? God steps away. And he says, okay, you have it your way. And I'll just let you go the way that you want to go. And he just turns them over to their sinful mind, so they begin to engage themselves in all of these unseemly acts and unrighteous acts. One of the worst things that God can do to us is to step away. It's to step away. And you might say, man, listen, I just want to do whatever I want to do. One of the worst things that God can do for you is to let you do that. If he just left you to yourself, it's kind of like the worst thing that a parent can do for their child is to just leave them to themselves. That's the way that the Bible says that God's wrath is revealed from heaven against the ungodliness of man. So that's the way that actually we're most acquainted with when it comes to God's wrath, is him stepping away. That's what you see in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, is God takes his hands off and he steps away, and he allows Satan to have his man and his antichrist come into power and to be able to do the things that he's tried to do many different times throughout history. And now he's going to move out of the way. We're going to see specifically how he does that in just a second. He's going to move out of the way and allow him to do that and all the evil that comes with it. In the second 3.5 years, we see the other way that God's wrath is revealed. And this way, God steps in. And if you thought that him stepping away was bad, you certainly don't want him to step in. You don't want him to step in. But he will also do that in our lives as well. In fact, when it comes to us as believers, this is what we would prefer. You remember whenever David was caught with Bathsheba and killing Uriah, her husband, and God gave him the choice. And he says, you can be turned over into the hands of man, or you can be turned over to me. And David said, please put me in your hands. You punish me. Don't turn me over to the hands of men. Put me in your hands. That I would much rather be punished that way. And I'm telling you, as believers, that's what we would want as well. We want the Lord to step in, to correct us, to chastise us, to punish us, to stop us from being so foolish. We want him to step in because that's what proves that he loves us as children and he corrects us. Now, when we see this in the time of tribulation, this is not the case. Now he's going to step in so that he can finally put an end to evil in the world. And he's going to bring forth his righteousness. So in the book of Job, just to illustrate this point even further, in the book of Job, remember Satan is brought before the Lord and the Lord says, what have you been doing? And he says, well, I've been going to and fro throughout the world. And God is the one who recommends Job to Satan. Do you remember? And he says, here's my servant. He's perfect and he escheweth evil. Have you considered Job? And you remember all through the story that Satan was not allowed to do anything to Job until he had God's permission first. And he would say, well, the reason why he stays true to you is because even though you've taken things from him, but you haven't taken his health. And he says, okay, well, you're allowed to touch his body, but you can't take his life. And Satan was only allowed to go as far as God was allowing him to do. Are you following with me? That's the same thing when people say, well, this is the wrath of Satan coming into the world. Well, there's some truth to that, but we have to remember that Satan doesn't have complete autonomy. He's only allowed to do what the Lord allows him to do. And the only reason why this first seal is even happening, as we saw in heaven, is because the Lord has allowed it to happen. So the entire 7 years, make no mistake, the entire 7 years of tribulation is a representation of God's wrath. The full 7 years is a representation of God's wrath without question. Christ is the only one who can crack the seals, and nothing is happening during this time period without him allowing it, right? He either allows it or he does it himself. So just remember, as you think about the tribulation, let's look at kind of the layout of tribulation. As a reminder, we talked about this at the first, but I just want to remind you about the tribulation layout. In this time, you're going to see, and this is kind of, some of this is my terminology, but you're going to see these seals, and you're going to see the trumpets, and you're also going to see what I call the villains. These are kind of the bad guys. There's a whole section that's just about the personages that are found in the book of Revelation. And then you're also going to have the 7 vials, where he pours out these 7 vials. And you have kind of 4 tellings. But the way that you should think about this story is not as one long chronological story, but rather it is the same story told 4 times. This is the same story. You should see them kind of stacked on top of each other. This is the same. When you see the 7 seals and you see the 7 trumpets and the 7 villains and the 7 vials, these are the same story told 4 times in a row, which really should be no surprise to us. Because what happened when Christ came the first time? What did we get? We got 4 times of the same story, didn't we? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is the same story told how many times? 4 times. It should be no surprise that when we talk about his second coming, that's exactly what we get as well. And the reason why we know this very clearly, and there's lots of reasons why we know this, but one reason why we know is because every time we read one of these accounts, it always ends with Christ coming back. It always ends at the end of the story. And then he says, and then after these things, John sees another vision. After this, he sees another vision where he sees the same story from a totally different perspective, and it ends with Christ's return again. And then he sees another vision after these things, and he sees another vision, and it ends with Christ's return. And then he sees the 4th one, and it goes through the same thing with 7 vials from another perspective, and it ends with Christ's return in great detail that time. And so whenever you understand it that way, the book of Revelation is so much more easy and simpler to understand. Whenever you understand that these are much like the Gospels in the sense that it's the same story told 4 times. Now, in between these stories, you will have a time when John will kind of pause in the midst of the seals and the trumpets, and between the trumpets and the vials and the personages. And he will give you like a little snapshot of really important information and events that are happening during these time periods. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so it's the same story told 4 times. Exactly like Christ's first coming is the same as his second coming. So let's take a look at chapters 6 and 7. We're really going to focus on chapter 6. And this is really the first telling of the story, the first telling of the time of revelation, of tribulation. And you will see, as we read through this, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see how it starts, and you'll see how it ends. So let's just read it. It says, "And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals." Who opened it? Jesus. Right. It wasn't Satan that opened it, was it? Oh, it's the Lamb that opened it. This table's really nice. That's really great. Feels fancy. So when the Lamb opens the seals, he says, "I heard, as it was, the noise of thunder, and one of the 4 beasts," remember those 4 beasts that had the faces and the lions and all that stuff? They said, "Come and see." And I saw. And here's where you see the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that many people know about. You see the white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. And when he had opened the second seal, now do you see how he went real quick there? It's like a white horse, a crown, a bow, and then he opened the second seal. And you just need to remember that this first telling of the story is very general. It gives you just a general understanding of what the tribulation will be like. And then as he moves into chapter 7, he's going to give you some very important information about what's going to happen during the time of tribulation. All right? So he gives you some general information. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." And I went out, and there was another horse that was red. And these horses obviously are a personification of what this time period will be marked by, right? This is a personification of what this time period will be marked by. "And I saw that the horse was red, and power was given him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, that they should kill one another." Do you see? God has stepped away, and he's like, "I'm just going to let you kill one another." It's like the way the cops used to handle the gangsters back in the 50s. They're like, "Man, why don't we just step back and just let them kill each other? Save us a whole lot of trouble." I'm kidding. That's not really God's kind of justice. But he steps away, and here's what they begin to do. They start to kill each other. "And there was given unto him a great sword. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, 'Come and see.' And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand," right? So this is going to have to do with their food. "And I heard the voice in the midst of the 4 beasts saying, A measure of wheat for a penny, 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see that thou hurt not the oil and the wine." We certainly don't want to hurt the wine. That's a joke. Okay, and when he had opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death. And this is why that we say this is a personification, that he's a personification of death. We believe in a literal approach to interpretation of the Bible. And if the Bible literally interprets something as a figure of speech, that's the way we're supposed to take it. It's not that we don't believe in symbolism and analogies. We do. We just allow the passage to tell us when something is supposed to be a personification or supposed to be symbolic or is supposed to be an allegory, right? And in here it clearly does. It says this horse was death. That's the clear definition of personification. It's saying this horse is supposed to represent death that is going to happen during this time. And hell followed with him. And power was given over to them over the 4th part of the earth to kill with the sword and with hunger and with death and with the beasts of the earth. And when he had opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And you're going to see a marked change right there at the 5th seal. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell in the earth?" And white robes were given unto every one of them, the martyrs, And it was said unto them that they should rest for a little season until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. In other words, they're saying, not yet. There is still more blood to be shed. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal. Now here we are at the sixth seal. Here's the end, okay, before we get to 7. And we see that the 7th seal, what that does is it opens up the second telling of the story. It opens up the trumpets. The only thing you find in the 7th seal is the beginning of the 7 trumpets. Are you following with me? So the 6th seal here is the end. Look what happens in the 6th seal. Open up the 6th seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Okay, now, just that right there, okay, that means the story's over. Do you guys know what would happen if we don't have any sun? The idea that we don't have any sun, and yet this is like the beginning of the story, and we still have so much story left. No, if you don't have any sun, it's over. There's no life on the planet. Do you understand me? If there's no sun and there's no moon. Okay, well, that's just one idea. But the stars of the heaven fell unto the earth. And even they fell as fig trees in their untimely figs when it's shaken with a mighty wind. And it says, and the heaven departed as a scroll. So the sun has been blacked out. The moon's become as blood. The stars have fallen out of the sky. And the heavens have been rolled up like a scroll. And every mountain and every island, or every mountain and island, not some, every mountain and island, they were moved out of their place. Just think about what we're describing. And the kings of the earth, and great men, and rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every freeman. Do you notice the continuity? It's everyone, everyone, right? They hid themselves in the dens and the rocks of the mountains. And why are they hiding themselves? And they said, man, we wish that the mountains and the rocks would just fall on us so that we could die. Why would they want that? They said, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. Why? For the great day of his wrath is come. And who shall be able to stand? He's telling us, he's giving us, again, it's in a very general way. It doesn't give us specifics. When we see the second telling of this with the trumpets, and even in the personages and the vials, we get a lot more detail and specifics. We also see great continuity whenever they retell those things. But we're talking about the end of the story here in the 6th seal. Now, when you get to chapter 7, John takes a moment before telling us about the 7th seal. You don't actually get to the 7th seal until chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. In chapter 7, John takes a moment, and he just kind of stops, and he informs us of an important event which takes place during the tribulation, which he will also do with the trumpets and the vial as well. So the first 2 verses of chapter 8, they open up the 7th seal, which begins the second telling of the story through the trumpets. Is everyone following with me? Do you feel like you've got somewhat of a grasp? Right here in chapter 6, you see the whole story in a snapshot. You see the whole story of the tribulation in a snapshot.